Welcome to the RC Roundtable podcast, where we discuss the latest RC hobby news, events, model reviews, and a whole lot more. Well, howdy ho, folks. Welcome to episode number 195 of a very special edition of the RC Roundtable. And yes, you see 4 quadrants, because today we have a very special guest, Santa Claus. Howdy, Santa. He's going to give us some airplane gifts for Christmas.
Yay!
No. But no, I kid. Joining, of course, myself, Fitz Walker, Lee, Ray, and Terry Dunn is, I don't know where to start. If you don't recognize this wonderful gentleman, I call him the Godfather of electric aircraft, the legendary Keith Shaw. Somebody, if you've been in the electric model airplane world for any time, especially, in the early days, the stone knives and bearskins, you know the name Keith Shaw. He's popped up in magazine articles. He's really been embedded in a lot of fly-in, done some legendary stuff, and we are overjoyed to have him here joining us this time on the RC Roundtable, where we can interrogate him. Ask him questions about his adventures. Enjoy his company. Oh man, I imagine we have a lot of questions for you, because you're one of the persons we've really talked about for quite some time. We'd love to talk to you, get on the show, and just really pick your brain, and because I remember personally, I've known of you for decades, since I started really getting into the RC models and electric powered RC models. I'm sure same for Lee and Terry, and so we are overjoyed. We really thank you for joining us today, and we hopefully. We'll endure a nice, great conversation with you, and hopefully won't go running and screaming into the next room after the first 10 minutes.
What an intro, folks.
There you go.
Take a breath. So,
believe anything of it.
Before Lee hit the record button, Keith was starting to tell us about his boyhood in Cleveland, and you were getting ready to talk about a specific point where you knew aviation was your future. So can you take us back to that?
It turned out that for people who are the historians, Cleveland was where all of the national air races took place, all the way from the 1930 all the way up into I think they're still going on, but there was a few-year hiatus during World War II. But my first memory in life, I was at the 1949 Cleveland Air Races. I was only a couple of years old. And they say you're not supposed to have memories before 5 or 6. I have the very distinct memory of this. We lived in downtown Cleveland at the time, but we had friends that lived out in Berea, which is right next to what is now Cleveland Hopkins Airport, which was where the Cleveland Air Races took place. And in this field, the course was not like you'd think today. The racing planes flew right over the top of the city, and there were various pylons, spread here and there in open fields that the planes flew between or around to make the whole course. And one of the pylons was in the middle of this field, near where friends of my parents had a house. And so we were sitting out in the backyard, and I'd say the pylon was maybe 150 feet away. And so the planes were coming right over the top of us.
Wow.
And, this was back in the, most of the Thompson racers were, modified World War II fighters. So very much like the Reno Air Races, have been. And I remember these very large, very loud objects going around, and everybody just sort of talking and everything. And then there was a very loud explosion and a big black ball of flame, and everybody started running. And that was when Bill Odom got succumbed to carbon monoxide and plowed into a house about a block from where we were sitting, and killed a mother and the child. And that was pretty much the end of of the Cleveland air races as I knew it for a good number of years until the 1960s, I think, is when they got restarted down on Burke Lakefront Airport. But so my first memory is effectively witnessing Bill Odom's crash. And now I started it like when I was 6. I started building, rubber band powered model airplanes on the streets of Cleveland, and I remember we lived on Euclid Avenue, and the street for some reason had these ridiculously wide sidewalks, and I would wind up the airplanes and sit them down. These little ones that I had made. They weren't kits. They were just cut out of little strips of balsa wood and a little bit of tissue paper and that. And I remember putting them down on this wide sidewalk, and they would flutter up into the air. But sometimes they'd go out into traffic, and very nice. All the traffic and the trucks and everything would come screeching to a halt, and I'd run out and get my little airplane and bring it back in. What can you imagine that happening today?
Right.
So, but it progressed, and eventually I got to the point where I was tinkering around. I taught myself electronics, and I was building some early radio control units of my own design. And I had a couple of things going for me. One was on Euclid Avenue, almost every block there was a war surplus store. Literally every block for many, 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 many blocks. And there were other ones too, but Euclid seemed to have a very large number of them. And the second thing was that I was sort of a semi-invalid. I had a lot of medical problems. I really couldn't go outside and play and do anything with other kids. So I had a lot of time on my hands, and my parents had taught me how to use the card catalog down at Cleveland Public Library. So I basically just chewed through every book I could find in the Cleveland Public Library to teach myself what I needed to know. And the third thing was my dad worked for what would become Union Carbide, and they made ever-ready batteries. And he, on the way out of the building that he worked in, where they made a lot of the big batteries, they had a room, 2 rooms. One was like the employee discount room where official products you could go and buy. But the other were the reject rooms where, things like with labels on upside down or something not right about the product, they couldn't sell it. And you got those for free. And so I'd showed him the batteries that I would need. And he would, every day on the way home he would walk by that room. And if one of those was there, he'd bring it. So that's how I got all my 67.5 volt batteries. And those were incredibly expensive. So 3 or 4 things added up that as a kid, I was able to fly RC. And everything was handmade. But I didn't know about escapements until about the second year I was in flying. I had made a weird little one-way actuator that was made out of 2 relays. So you just started the engine, hand-launched this big hulking airplane with all the vacuum tubes and all the batteries in it, and the little tiny rudder tab had 2 positions. It would circle to the right or it would circle to the left. Every time you punched the button, it would go to the other direction. So that's how I taught myself to fly.
So were you kind of on an island of those developments? You didn't have any
I didn't really
reference?
I sort of knew that people had built radio control. And in the typical in some of the magazines I was able to get a hold of, there were pictures of people with airplanes. So I know it had been done, but there was no way I could afford to buy any of that equipment. So I just went to war surplus stores and scavenged parts and pieces and ended up making the radios and making them work, sort of, and I got them to work. So I started out flying when most kids were playing Little League. I was flying RC, so, or at least trying to.
As you describe it, you're downplaying the technological achievement that seems to be back in the late 50s. So, I'm very impressed by the fact that you were making your own radio equipment at any age.
Yeah, well, my parents both worked full time, so they had, it was sort of tough. We didn't have a whole lot.
Right.
And but they never, while they really didn't have time to really get in back active to encourage me, also didn't discourage me.
Right.
And so I grew up in an environment with the library as a source of information, parts and time, because I really couldn't go out and play baseball and stuff like that with the other kids. And I spent all my time, figuring out how to do things. And I didn't think it was anything unusual. I just did it,
Right.
and they would, when I would ever get it to the point where I would try, they would invest an afternoon and get me out to there was no flying club at that time. We'd just go out and find some big open field in the middle of nowhere and
Mhm.
the side of the road and start it up and launch it and hand launch it and hope it worked. So,
So was the same thing true for the airframes that you built? Did you kind of go off on your own to figure out how to do that?
yeah, they were all my own designs. I looked at a lot of plans, or every once in a while, the hobby shop owner, I would always go in with a couple of pennies or nickels to buy a few little sticks or a piece of balsa wood. And every once in a while, he would hand me some kit with an inch of dust on it that apparently had not sold or whatever, just here,
Right.
or he'd sell it to me for a nickel or something. And so I did have a few airplanes that were, like free flight. Those were back in the rubber powered airplane days.
Right.
Free flight airplanes and that. But like I said, periodically he would just hand me things that were, stuff that he just couldn't get rid of. And I sometimes figure out how to use them. Sometimes I couldn't figure out how to make use of them either. So,
Well, that leads me to my next question. As you're figuring out how to build this radio equipment and how to build airplanes, I have to imagine there were some spectacular failures that went along with it.
Yes.
So
yes.
what's your most memorable and dramatic failure from that period?
Oh, there was a lot of wing folds, a lot of, launching the airplane and then, it obviously was not responding. So you'd get on a bicycle and start chasing it and hope to find it, keep eye on it. So sometimes you'd find it. Sometimes I always had my name on it. It would show up a few days later. Or you get a phone
Oh, really?
call. Yeah, you get a phone call and somebody had found it, or it was up in a tree somewhere in their lot. And so, as far as I witnessed a couple of incredible experiences that there's absolutely no way that this could possibly happen if you lay it out. There was a fellow in the club, eventually in 1962, I think, I joined the American Airlines, which is, I think to this day, the oldest model airplane club in the United States. They were one of the few that continued through World War II, but they started out in like 1927.
Wow.
And I belonged to them. And this was in the day of everybody pretty much was super regen, which meant one airplane at a time, and most of it was escapement. There were a few people that had reed sets, but that was a fairly advanced thing at the time. And nobody was flying proportional yet that I remember. But, and he always kept having airplanes fly away or, end up and he never could see them. So he came out with an Esquire that had been done in bright pink silk. I mean, it hurt to look at it. It was such a bright color. And he launched it, and at that time we were flying off of it was just an unimproved area, no runway to speak of, that a farmer let us fly out of. So you just hand launched everything and landed it. But the next field over was fairly low soybeans because it was a new crop. And he was up with it, and after a few minutes, the escapement hung, and it spiraled and went down into the ground in the next field over. We could see the little puff of dust, And he sort of head down, walked off to get the remains of the airplane. And he came back and he says, "You guys aren't going to believe it. I can't find it." So a bunch of other guys got up and they started milling around in this soybean patch, couldn't find it. So the whole group, like 20 guys, did the shoulder to shoulder thing and started marching through the soybean field, trying to not to step on the beans, obviously. And about the third pass through, all of a sudden, one guy you hear this, "Yike!" And he got shorter by about 3 feet. And there was a drainage culvert about 2 foot in diameter. and the airplane had hit it, gone into it, the wings had folded, and the whole airplane had gone down into the drainage culvert. And this guy had stepped and fallen in on top of it.
Wow.
So what's the chance that a completely uncontrolled airplane would spiral down and end up going into a 2-foot diameter vertical drainage pipe?
Yeah. When it's your time, it's your time.
Yeah, right. Well, back then, I mean, if you came home with an airplane in one piece and you got 2 or 3 flights, you had the equivalent of a steak and champagne dinner. I mean,
Right.
yeah, I mean, it was a miracle when the airplane actually flew and the radio worked all the way through, and everybody was incredibly happy. But everybody supported each other, and some guy's airplane would end up in a forest. The entire club would go and start marching through the forest and try to find it for them.
Wow.
So it was just the way it was. I mean, because you knew that your time was up someplace, and you want, be nice for them to come with you. So.
Right.
Yeah, what's interesting is at that time there were no ARFs, so every plane was something that you spent a long time building.
Yeah, every airplane and silk, and there was pre-monocoat, and most of them were glow engines. Very few had throttles, so most of these airplanes were, had basically a rudder control, no elevator, no ailerons. You just started the engine, and you tried to set it so you had enough power to gently climb. And when you did a turn, because you'd lose a little altitude on the turn, you'd hopefully gain that back on the straightaway, so you could sort of more or less keep it in. The engine would have quit, and then you'd glide in and land. That's what it was. That's what you were happy. The idea of aerobatics, the ideas of doing anything was long in the distance. But if you got really good at it with just a rudder airplane and no throttle, you could loop and roll and do Cuban 8s and do a thing called a vertical 8, but it was a half onside loop with a roll and a half inside on the bottom and a half roll.
Wow.
Yeah.
Vertical 8.
Had a chance to fly something like that. There was a guy, a friend of the show, name is Tony Accurso, did that. He set up a rudder-only 049 powered, I think it was 049 or 020, and he just did it. It was an old kit, I forgot what it was called, but it was originally set up for that. And he said, well, let's try that. Well, use modern radio equipment. He had a 2.4 gigahertz transmitter, but it only had rudder. And he let me fly it, and you're right, it was more fun than I thought it would be, actually. Once you got used to how to control it, it was really pretty neat.
Yeah, and doing a good spot landing with a flare with just rudder is an accomplishment.
Wow.
That's bragging rights.
You have no control of the glide path. All you can do is slightly speed the airplane up in a turn. So you did a turn just before you lined up for the runway, a few inches off the ground. And that little extra speed would then make the nose pull up. And if you did everything right, the wheels would touch at exactly that time. And you'd get a nice flared landing with just rudder.
Wow.
But obviously you get one shot at it.
Right.
Right.
Well, with this next question, I think we're probably going to skip a big chunk of very interesting things from your modeling history. But from what I understand, in the 70s, you began experimenting or working with electric-powered RC models.
Correct.
So what was the catalyst for that? And what was the...
And how many gallons did you drink?
Right.
Okay, my main interest, probably still would be, except I love pylon racing. I was always an avid pylon racer. I flew the old AMA Delta class. Actually technically held the national record for a good for a while, but and in the late 60s, there was a thing called Goodyear racing, which eventually became Formula One, but Goodyear. And I flew that, and it was really active. Now, the thing when you fly pylon racing is once you get the airplane dialed and trimmed out, you don't fly it except in battle. You can't sport fly them. It's not the way it works. And so I needed something to tinker with to keep me occupied, so I didn't want to go fly the racing plane. And in the Goodyear, I flew microfilm indoor.
Oh.
Separate technology, just got interested in that and flew it in competition and had a lot of fun just to keep me away from flying well, in the early 70s, I was very active in quarter midget pylon, the 15 size racing planes. And again, I needed something to, divert me so I didn't fly the racing plane. And at that time, I'd been thinking about electric and power, and there were starting to be some articles showing up by people who were, homemade motors, home wound motors, and stuff like that. And so I got interested and started tinkering and building. And the first electric I had, which I think was 1974, if I remember right, I held up as high as I could hold it over my head and very gently placed it in the air. And I got about 3 laps around the field, slowly descending. But it was flying,
Yeah.
more than it would be on a glide, but that was it. And it eventually crashed, and it was incredibly fragile and built very fragile because it was so tiny amount of power we had at the time. And eventually I got it to the point where I had an airplane that could, take off and even loop. Couldn't do much else, but it was a viable, I guess you'd say, electric airplane. It could take off a pavement, I should say that. So I started tinkering, and I guess everybody would look at the weight of the power system and then, build huge airplanes to get the wing loading low because there's not much power here. And I went the other way. As I looked at the power there was, designed an airplane for the power, and just lived with the higher wing loading because I'm a fairly decent pilot. And so I was flying airplanes that could do inside and outside loops and fairly aggressive aerobatics when with power systems, most people were doing good to get a glider to go up with.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the start. And I think I went to the KRC meet, which was the Keystone Radio Control Club over in Pennsylvania. It was sort of the world famous mainstay of, this is anybody who flew electrics tried to go there.
Yeah, I remember seeing that in magazines.
I started going to those in, I think it was about 1982. I think was the first one I went to. And they were always over in the Philadelphia area.
And I would guess at that time, electric was still a very cult fringe of the hobby.
Oh, yeah. And in fact, I think at that meet, there was like 30 people at that meet, and that people were literally from all over the country.
Mm-hmm.
There seemed to be a contingent out on the West Coast. There were the Boucher brothers, Astro Bob and Roland Boucher. There was Mitch Poling up and another fellow up in the sort of the Seattle area. And not much else on the West Coast. And on the East Coast, there was Bob Kopsky in Pennsylvania, myself. There was some fellow that was down in Florida, I think. There was just a handful of people who were tinkering with electrics, and we would write letters back and forth. This is before the days of the internet, obviously, and phone calls were too expensive, so we'd write letters back and forth of our experiences and that. And finally, we all sort of got together. A bunch of us ended up going to the KRC meeting. And I tried to go every year. And every year I would try to build, the next generation of an advanced airplane, And at that point, I stayed ahead of the curve for a long time. Mostly because it was a way for me to enjoy the engineering and perfecting a very advanced airplane, which has always interested me. And it was a venue for people to see it and, maybe get an idea of this is what it may turn out to be eventually. You might be able to do this, but a lot of it was with homemade equipment that really wasn't available. Because I could pull more out of equipment than most people seem to be able to. So,
did you ever?
I built big scale airplanes. I built twins. I built racing planes. I built, one of the very first ducted fan airplanes. It was just technology run wild. I just had a lot of fun doing it. So.
Did you ever do any collaboration with some of the early manufacturers of motors or
mostly Astroflight. Bob Boucher and I got along pretty well. We're both iconoclasts, but we seem to appreciate each other's strengths. And so I did a lot of work. I also worked with Roland Boucher. I worked with who was Leisure Flight at that
right,
time.
yeah. I haven't read it in a long time.
And then Tom Samato, who was Maxim,
right.
Maxcim. That was Tom Samato. He was over in the New York area somewhere. Those were pretty much the only ones that I. Oh, and David Palumbo was the guy that started Aviox.
Right.
And so I had
right.
I had the first Aviox, out of the factory, so to play with, and I put it in an existing airplane, and at KRC flew it, did all sorts of demos with it, and was doing vertical 4-point rolls when everybody else was happy to do a inside loop, and so it was like I said, it was, but I had a thing that if I was going to, with all of these companies, if I was going to use an off-the-shelf stock piece of equipment, I paid for it. Or sometimes they would give me a discount, but it was still, I'd pay for it. If it was a raw prototype, a one-off prototype, then it was expected to be free because 90% of the time it blew up.
Yeah.
And,
you're the beta tester.
I was more like the alpha tester.
Alpha, yeah, okay.
Yeah. And then, I'd help try to figure out what went wrong. And after 2 or 3 go-arounds, we'd finally get it working, and I'd do all sorts of tests on it and publish. And then I'd come up with what I thought was the absolute extremes that the motor could possibly do. And then multiply all those by 2/3, and that's usually what got published. With when they were put up for sale, those were the do not exceed numbers, were 2/3 of what I had pushed it to. So,
oh, wow.
Because a lot of times the extreme requires perfect cooling and perfect prop choice and this and that and whatever, and people aren't going to do that. They're going to just do what they have to do. Right. They're going to take it out of the box, bolt it on an airplane, and hope for the best. So.
Well, the Boucher brothers very famously did not get along with each other to the point that they both made their own electric aircraft companies. Is that an accurate assessment?
Yeah, they didn't get along with each other, but initially Astroflight was both of them.
Okay.
They were together. The big split came when there was a huge, out in California, RC cars just all of a sudden showed up out of nowhere and took off. And Roland wanted to go to the RC car route and start developing motors for that, and Bob didn't want to do it. So that's when they split. And so originally Leisure was RC car motors. And then he started, marketing it also as airplane motors. He had found a really good, there were several Japanese motors that he had found that were excellent motors. There was a yellow motor. It was called an Igarashi. It was a really good motor. And then the famous Sagami, the black Sagami motor, was just probably the best ferrite motor ever made for that kind of purpose. And everything back then was all just ferrite brushed motors. And over in Germany, Keller made one of the first cobalt motor. And it was just head and shoulders above anything else. And Bob made a couple of experimental cobalt motors. I got one of them to play with. And then he put it in production, and it became the quote-unquote Astroflight cobalt motors. And I used those on almost all of my scale airplanes. There were a few planes that had other brands of motors, but no, it was pretty much everything was Astroflight because we got along. I actually sort of enjoyed helping them debug the motors and advertise what they could do, because my philosophy was, don't push the motor to the limit. If you're doing it, something's wrong with the design. Mm-hmm. And so you buy a motor, you design the airplane right, you set it up correctly, and it lives forever. I still have dozens and dozens of airshow airplanes that still have Astro Cobalt brushed motors in them. Yeah, they've been converted to, I don't fly the lithium polymer batteries. I fly the A123 lithium iron phosphate batteries. But all of them are still flying after almost 40 years. They're all still flying, and they're still doing great. The Astro Cobalts were pretty efficient. They were 75%, 80% efficient. That's not much
Yeah.
less. Not much less than most of the brushed motors or brushless motors today. So
Yeah, Terry's a big fan of those. He's got quite a collection building up.
yeah,
Yeah, I may or may not have a problem.
yeah.
It's a good kind of problem to have.
I, in addition to all of the ones that are still in airplanes, I probably have about a 30-pound box, at least 30 pounds of other astromotors or prototypes that met their demise. I have a horror, a horror, a museum of horror of how some of them self-destructed and stuff that I've kept of, how things can, what a motor looks like when it blows a magnet at 30,000.
Yeah, they're probably demagnetized.
Wow.
You can smell them from a mile away.
Yeah, right.
Wow, that's
So-
interesting.
When I got into electric flying was the late 90s, and that's when Speed 400s were a big thing. It's still brushed motors and NICADs, but I found it interesting that there was still a lot of, what's the word? The friction between glow power pilots and electric pilots. We were still frowned upon in a lot of cases. So when you were doing all this developmental work in the 80s, were you experiencing much resistance, pardon the pun, from the mainline pilots?
Not really. Most of them either looked upon me as like, well, the weird guy in the corner playing around with these things that are never going to go anywhere.
Right.
But I would I built some very advanced airplanes at the time, and I remember going to it was a giant scale meet in Lansing, Michigan, which is about an hour from here. And it was, I think, like the national gathering of giant scale at that time, it was a huge meet. And I took my de Havilland Comet. This was so it would have been like 1985 or 1986, and which is 88-inch span, so it's easily giant scale. And it's a twin, and it has retracts. And I took it with me and went up there, and everybody sort of looked at it strangely. And there was so many people there that you had to be in this ridiculously long queue to fly. I mean, there were like 20 or 30 people waiting in line to fly.
Yeah. For those who don't know, there used to be a thing called an impound and frequency control.
Right.
So, yeah.
It wasn't so much that, it was just the number of people that were. They were only letting like 2 people go out at a time. And
oh, wow.
There were hundreds and hundreds of people there.
Wow.
Because these were all really big airplanes, and so it wasn't like little foam things where you can get 100 of them up or something. Each airplane is a significant investment in time that the person made or whatever. And just by happenstance, the 2 people in front of me both had twins. And one guy had a P-38, and they fiddled around with it. And they finally got the engines running, and he took off and right on schedule. He got about 10 feet in the air. The one engine quit. And the P-38 is probably the single worst twin ever designed on the planet to have an engine out. So the engines are far apart. They are farther apart than any other airplane. And when one engine quits, the airplane instantaneously effectively does what's the equivalent of sort of like a half snap roll and just augers in, which it did. And it spread. It was like an 8-foot span, 8 or 9 foot span P-38. It just
You just triggered Lee, by the way.
Turned into toothpicks. And then the next airplane was a guy with a big Cessna Bobcat, the bamboo bomber.
Sure.
Oh, yeah.
Had a big Cessna, and he trundled on a runway, and an engine would quit. He'd get it restarted. It trundled, and he finally, but it wouldn't quite lift off. It was big, and it wasn't very highly powered. And about the 3rd time he was trying to take off, he veered off the runway and hit one of the, this was at an airport, and hit one of the landing lights. And it just decimated the airplane.
Yeah.
And so after all of the hype of twin engine, whatever, it was my turn next. And I went out with, I taxied out with the Comet. I took off, did my entire routine, the inside loops, rolls, point rolls, did the low inverted flyby, came in, landed, and taxied back in front of me. And it was absolutely dead silent, not only because the airplane didn't make any noise, but there was no noise from the crowd whatsoever. And there was when I finally shut the motors down in front of me, it was about a 4-second late, and then it was just this huge, yell and scream, and people running up and down and wanting to know all about electric flight. So And I've heard that flight changed an awful lot of people's minds. I mean, I still meet people today, and I got an electric because I saw this guy. I saw you fly this black twin back in back at that meeting in Lansing. So every once in a while, you're in the right place at the right time to make an, to sow an idea. So I was lucky that way. I was able to influence things. And I remember when you brought up Speed 400s. I was pushing for the bigger astroflight kind of things, and then all of a sudden the Speed 400 craze started up, and I was like, well, okay, it's sort of a step backward in technology, but the big thing is they flew amazingly well. They were accessible. You didn't mind hand launching the airplane; they were fine, and they were very affordable.
Yep.
And it was at the time it's not exactly what I wanted to see happen, but I'm okay with that. And if they're having fun, the whole reason we're in this hobby is to enjoy it. If you're not smiling, go and find another hobby or do something else.
Right. Yeah. From the price point alone, I think it allowed a lot of people to get past the barrier of entry for electrics.
They did work really well. I mean, I have to admit that as long as you sort of kept to a reasonable size airplane and reasonable props, and there was like an inner community, that the Speed 400 community, and they sort of spread knowledge back and forth between themselves. Everybody knew this voltage motor with this number of cells and this prop on this airplane is going to fly.
Yep.
And everybody went out and had a good time. So that was great. And then eventually, and those people got enough experience that they started building bigger airplanes. And so, eventually we sort of, I don't want to use the word got back on track, but it was a very important side branch of the electric sport. It brought a lot of people in at a level where it's not that they couldn't afford a bigger electric airplane. They just didn't want to risk that much money and then find they might be disappointed. And they got the confidence that electrics worked through the Speed 400s, that then they would lay down the $100 or $150 for an Astroflight motor.
Right. Yeah, it was the gateway drug to electric flying for a lot of people in the late 90s.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
yes,
it was for me.
Very much so. Yeah.
Yeah, because I remember, I told the story before, I worked at a hobby shop in the late 80s, early 90s, and somebody had ordered an Astroflight motor. And it was like, it was beautiful, but it was really expensive. It was like, who are going to pay that much for an electric motor when we're selling the little Mabuchi RC car motors for $20 or whatever?
Yeah.
And the guy orders
there's
$200.
a whole lot more technology in there. There's real ball bearings, but the biggest thing was the magnets were samarium cobalt.
Right.
Samarium
Oh, yeah.
is a rare earth magnet that's extremely expensive, and it is virtually impossible to machine. You have to buy incredibly expensive equipment to deal with samarium cobalt.
Yeah, when we understood the technology, it was just, it was such a leap of faith to get one. I think that's what scared a lot of people off. And
I agree. I mean, like I said, I after some thinking, I realized that the Speed 400 let people test the waters, find out that, yes, this is sort of fun, and you don't have to come home smelling like a, Klotz factory, and, and you found out, flying in winter was now not a problem at all. You just pick the airplane up and toss it. It worked.
And then some company made the Zagi, and the world was never the same.
Yeah.
Worst flying wing design ever.
Oh, this interview's over.
Strike two.
The only thing that airplane was valid is because the materials was break after the crash, it would survive. And people, hey, this is great, and they'd launch it again. And the reason it crashed was a bad design. So
it was good enough.
It was wrong choice of airfoils. I'm a flying wing nut. I have built probably, with conservative, I've probably built 60 or 70 flying wings in my life. Everything from deltas to swept wings to swept forward wings to.
Fitz, show me your plane.
Yeah, my plane. I got an end. Which one are you thinking of?
The red one.
Red one.
The crazy wing?
The board swept one?
Yeah, just to show him that. Just to show him another wing design.
Oh, I was going to say, because I have an N9 short kit.
I had an N9 at Toledo an electric N9 was my Toledo project in, I think, 1979.
Wow. Might have to hit you up for some hits or tips whenever I build it.
I'll tell you right now, don't believe anything Northrop said. He had no idea how to design a flying wing. You want to know about flying wings, build Hortons.
Horton. Oh, yeah, the Horton, yeah.
The
We know somebody who's
the Horton
been on
brothers knew what they were doing.
Yeah, there's a gentleman that's been on the show. He's 3D printing at Horton, 229,
Chris Gata or something like that, I think is his name.
Krakow.
I talked to him
Was it
down
Krakow?
at,
yeah.
we had many conversations down at the, what's the big electric meet that's down in,
Seth?
Seth?
No.
Which state?
It's down right at the border between Indiana and Kentucky. It's over by Louisville, Kentucky. Jet Jam.
Oh, the Jet. Okay, yeah. That's
We
it.
came to that, and we spent a good number of hours under the tent talking about Hortons and flying wings and what you got to do to make them work, and
Wow.
what to do and what not to do. And I've heard that he's got his working. Yeah, he saw mine fly. And I have a Horton 9 that, rockets around the sky. It's got two little tiny Wemotech 2-inch diameter, fans and Astra O1s and a little 3-cell battery pack. It does probably 100+ mile an hour. You can do vertical rolls with it, and it flies like 10 minutes on a little 1800 mil battery pack. So,
If I remember an article. I think you built a Bugatti racer at some point.
I still have it.
With
Still race
the
it. Still fly.
contra rotating props
Yep.
as well.
I machined my own gearbox.
Oh, that's hardcore.
Oh, yeah, well, actually, I designed 7 gearboxes. I made 3 of them, or I made 4 of them. The one never really got tested. So 3 that I functioned, 2 flew in a test bed airplane, and what I deemed to be the best of the one was when it went into the Bugatti. But it took me about 5 years of work to get all of that working right. It took me about 5 years to get the ducted fan problem solved. That was the first Horton I built was 1992, and that was homemade rotors, homemade fans, 20 NiCads, and a 62-inch wingspan wing, and it did 125 mile an hour. I could do 3 vertical rolls, and I got a 1 minute and 45-second motor run.
Landing speed was 106 miles an hour.
Yeah, you can fry eggs on the motor.
It wasn't not quite that bad, but it was bungee. It was launched with a very high power bungee launch because I had designed the fans to. You can either try to have some static thrust or you design them for speed. And I designed them for speed to make every bit of use out of the fan I could, because as soon as you start trying to design for lower static thrust, you kill the efficiency of the fan.
Speed, yeah.
So I designed more like compressors than classic, at the time was considered ducted fans.
Interesting.
And this bungee cord was like 3/4-inch diameter bungee, or rubber tube, surgical rubber tubing with a 1/4-inch wall. And it pulled back to the point where just about, it was everything somebody who was going to launch it for me could do to hang on to the thing. And then you let it go, and it would get up to speed, and then I could turn the fan on, because statically the fans were cavitated. It would make this outrageous shrieking sound. And it probably had to get up to 50 miles an hour before the fans put out any thrust whatsoever.
Wow.
But at the other end, you got 125 miles an hour and 3 vertical rolls. So
nice.
It was hilarious. It was a crazy airplane. It was from the launch to the landing was 2 minutes flat. At 1 minute and 45 seconds of motor run and 15 seconds on a landing approach. And it was, but it felt like you were flying for like 10 minutes. I mean, you came down drained.
Very thrilling. So I had a question on that vein. What would you think was your most challenging model you've ever built?
Construction-wise was probably the Bugatti. That is it.
Yeah,
There's no flat lines. I had to develop a special set of. I had to build more jigs than most people ever build airplanes to hold all the parts in place while I basically built the airplane. That was probably the most challenging structure I ever built.
Did you reference the example at the EAA museum?
Yeah, I was fortunate. I my career was a research physicist, and companies all over the country would pay me to come to help them figure out what was wrong with their experiments, or I'm really good with instrumentation, stuff like that. And I was at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, I think it is.
Mhm.
Yeah, I was there, and I was going to be there for like 3 or 4 days, but there was a weekend, and so I stayed a couple of days, and I went over to Oshkosh to see the AAA museum. And I was in the upper floor, and I looked out the window, and there was a truck going down the back road with something with a canvas over and the tri-tail sticking out of the back of the truck. It was when they were delivering the Bugatti.
Oh, wow.
I didn't have a camera with me. I went to the gift shop, bought like 3 of these, disposable cameras.
Oh yeah, I remember those little Kodak
found where they had taken it, and as they were unloading it, started shooting pictures.
Wow.
And I got all of those, and some close-up detail, and when they lifted the wing off the truck, I got the top view of the wing, and I got the side view of the fuselage from a distance. And I was able to put all that together and draw a set of plans and do all the engineering, and then it was a matter of, okay, now I can, I've got the airplane, now we have to figure out how to power it. And that was when the gearbox experiences started to show up. I kept designing different gearboxes, trying to get it all to work. A bunch of them were one motor, but with combinations of ways of doing it. You drive 2 props off of one motor.
Sure.
Eventually, though, it turned out that it was just too hard to get the gear ratio. There was no real way of changing it all. And it became very apparent that the props are in incredibly different environments. And so I remade the gearbox for 2 Astro 05s, the brushless 05s, instead of the one big Astro 40, so that I could tune the gear ratios. I could change pinions, and I could get it finely dialed in. And I had built a little data system that could look at RPM and current. And it didn't download it; it would just record it. Okay. And I would go up and fly maneuvers, and fly the airplane and bring it down and plug it into a computer, and I could see, based on what the video camera was showing the airplane was doing, to what the RPM and the currents were doing. I could get an idea, and then I would change the gear ratio until I optimized it all. So,
oh, nice.
That was cool. The only way. Yeah. I had a bunch of flights pre doing all that. I actually had a couple of flights with the single motor gearbox system, and it just never really flew well. It got off the ground, but it wasn't very impressive. When I finally dialed it in and got it working with the twin motor system, then it started to really go. And it's also got probably I'm a prejudice, but I think it's the greatest sounding model airplane ever made.
I would imagine. Yeah.
If you've ever heard, there were some videos of it. I flew it down at Muncie one year, and they had a little video clip. It may still be available, but it has got an incredibly unique sound to the gearbox. The 2 props and it's like no other model airplane on the planet.
Well, if it makes you feel better, Pratt & Whitney had the same issues creating gearboxes to drive contra-rotating props with one engine. So you're not alone.
Yeah, well, that actually, they learned a lot because the first airplane that I know of that had the counter-rotating box, first engine was the Griffin, the Rolls-Royce Griffin.
Oh, British, yeah.
Yeah, they were trying to run it. You have all this horsepower. How do you soak it up in a prop? And they were going up to like 5 blade props on the early Tempests, with that engine in it. Right. And they were still not being able to soak up the horsepower. So then they built the counter-rotating prop. And that, were a couple of Reno racers that used that. Miss Ashley and Precious Metal both used the counter-rotating gearbox system. And yeah, they've got an interesting sound, but nothing like the Bugatti. So in addition to being a really cool, futuristic-looking airplane, it also sounds like nothing else. So. Yeah, I always get a big grin when I fly, just because I love listening to it.
Yeah, it's interesting. The conversation is hitting all sorts of interesting points for me. We talked a minute ago about Northrop. I'm reading a book about Northrop, like the beginning of his designs through, I guess, all the way up to the B2. But where we're at now, they just finished testing the N9M. They're working on the B35. So it's interesting to hear your take on his wing design not being that great, at least compared to the Hortons.
Yeah. What the problem, Northrop was really good at being a salesman or, selling his ideas and that, but they would always quote what the airplane, they always worded it sound like they had tested it.
Right.
They had never tested the speeds. They had never tested the load lifting capability. They had never let anybody else outside the company fly it. So all the way up to the XB-49, there was never any serious testing ever done on any of those wings. And what you don't know, a lot of those airplanes crashed and pilots killed.
Yeah.
That's what Edwards.
He understood the method of the pitch control of it, but he never understood the yaw dynamics of it. And they kept putting more and more control surfaces to try to control the yaw, to give yaw functions, but they never tried to solve the yaw problem. They figured that was the pilot's fault. It was the pilot's game. He had to learn how to do that. And no, you can't do that. You've got to put some degree of yaw stability into the airplane. If you're not going to have a fin, there's other ways of doing it. And the Hortons had figured it out back in the 30s. They were flying very high performance sailplane wings that had been extensively tested, and other people flew them. And they had some problems, but they were pretty honest with the numbers that they put out and the testing that they had done. But Northrop never submitted their airplanes for testing, or at least the wings. They remained pretty much in-house prototypes.
Right. Was the Horton approach to use washout?
A very specific. It's a nonlinear washout, and you have to come up. The whole trick, if you want to do a trick, is the real reason that you need to have a fin on an airplane. It does two things. It is like the feathers on an arrow. It gives you some sort of pointing stability, some static pointing stability. But mostly it's there because when you give ailerons, there's a thing called adverse yaw. Well, the moment of inertia on an airplane is very large on the roll axis, but it's pretty small it's really quite small on the yaw axis, and then pitch axis somewhere in the middle. If you didn't have the fin, when you would give ailerons, the adverse yaw would take place long before the roll could ever take place. So the airplane would basically skid sideways long before it could ever roll. And when it skid sideways, it would go. Northrop lost a good number of airplanes with a thing called the tumble. If you skid the airplane sideways enough, effectively the trailing wing goes into the shadow and produces no lift, and the airplane starts tumbling around the leading wing, sort of an outside tumble. And they lost a good number of airplanes to that. So the game is you have to come up with a nonlinear twist that puts the wingtips in a negative lifting condition, so that now when you give aileron, you get proverse yaw rather than adverse yaw, and so you get a coordinated turn. And the Horton brothers came up with a methodology. They were really amazing. They weren't professional aeronautical engineers. They were self-taught. They were modelers. They did a lot of this with models, with like catapult models and that. But they had figured out how to trick a wing into producing proverse yaw with the ailerons. And they were flying these ultra high efficiency sailplanes, in the mid 30s, like the Horton 4. These airplanes with 40-to-1 glide ratios that, the glass super ships didn't get there until the 50s or 60s. And they had some idiosyncrasies. They weren't perfect, but they were pretty amazing airplanes. And they had figured it all out. And they actually had written all of their stuff down and sent it to Northrop. because they had heard that he was interested in flying wings. This was back in, everybody loved flying. This was in the 30s, before
the war, yeah.
Dark clouds on the horizon.
Yeah.
Rumor has it that Horton sort of looked at the book and threw it in the wastebasket. I mean, Northrop.
Northrop,
Like, not invented here. Clunk.
Jeez. Hubris.
So, right. Yeah, but I said the Horton brothers were really amazing for basically they were building these high-performance sailplanes in there. I think, like, Reimar was the first one they flew. I think Reimar was 15 and Walter was, I think, 19.
Wow.
Walter did the mathematics. Reimar was the engineering and construction whiz. And then they were flying these, like a Horton 4, I think, when Reimar was, I think, 19 or 20, and Walter was like 24, 25. And it was light years ahead of anybody else, and they worked. Because I struggled through. I built an N1, I built an N9, I built an XB35. They flew terribly. And I just some models. I mean, it was just a problem of just scaling models didn't work.
Yeah.
And they had these terrible problems, these tumble problems. They'd go into, you'd blink and they'd go into like a flat spin or equivalent of, and just not good. And I was about ready to, I thought it was just something I was doing. And in there was a newsletter for the Antique Sailplane World edited by, I think, Jan Scott. And I used to get it because I loved antique sailplanes too. That was one of my side interests. And in one of the images, he had this beautiful top view of this flying wing. And he said, more or less like, tune in next issue for information about this unique airplane. And it was a Horton 2 is what the top view was. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't wait for the next issue to show up. And when I did, I started reading about it, and they had some photos of it. And the Horton brothers were like unheard of at that point. And I went out and started, requesting books from all over the world, from Germany, through the library, and read everything I could about their designs, and started to and I built a Horton 2, and it flew like a dream. I mean, wow. It was just, I had to sort of reverse engineering this idea, this nonlinear wing twist. But I figured out what they were hinting, what they were going for. And I figured out a way of doing it with model calculational methods. And it flew, it was a sweetheart. I mean, you could not get it to spin. There was no fin on it whatsoever. Had a pusher Sagami 05 motor in it, actually.
Wow.
I took it to KRC, and and then I started building it, and then I built the great big King Crimson, the 11-foot wingspan 4-motor retract monster, and that's still flying, and that's also a Horton design, or a Horton aerodynamics. So
right. Huh, that's interesting.
They knew what they were doing.
Yeah. So at the end of the war, when the Allies and the Russians are swooping up all the engineers, where did the Hortons end up?
Reimar went to Argentina, and he actually continued, and there was a whole bunch of flying wings that they built in Argentina. Walter stayed in Germany. The Allies didn't seem to be interested in flying wing design for some reason. They just, who knows what, but he ended up going, like I say, he was the mathematics whiz in the crew between the two of them. He was also a craftsman, but mathematics whiz. And he got interested in sailboat hull design. And apparently all of the racing sailboats, like, the America Cup, the World's Cup sail racing, up until only 10 or 20 years ago, all of them kept using his more and more and more advanced designs that Reimar Walter Horton had designed.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. But
I guess there's a lot of crossover, hydrodynamics and aerodynamics.
Well, it's
fluid dynamics, right?
Fluid dynamics, and mathematics is mathematics, and once you start applying it, you figure out how it all works. But that was his interest. He went off and became famous for that. Or most people don't know that, but like I said, he had designed all of these very futuristic hull designs, and one by one, people would, when finally got beat, they would sort of look up the next design that he had done, build that would beat the previous one, and his hull designs just kept being at the forefront, but they never ever said anything about that. I didn't find about that. I didn't find about that until many years later.
Wow.
So that was all his hull designs. So.
All right, I've got another question, but I want to give Lee an opportunity to pipe up here. We've been keeping you down, buddy.
No, it's all good. Keith, are you still flying today?
Oh yeah.
Okay, so what is your go-to plane? What is the plane that you throw in your car and you just really enjoy flying these days? Out of the hundreds you have.
Yeah, I have something like 50 operational airplanes, because when I go to air shows, every group or every place seems to like either pattern planes, or they like scale, World War II, or they like, and I try to sort of fit more what they need for that, that environment and that. I think one of the airplanes I enjoy flying the most, and it goes out to the field with me a lot, is a Clem 20. The Clem airplanes, everybody in the United States learned to fly in a Piper Cub. Everybody in Britain learned to fly in a Gypsy Moth or a Tiger Moth. Everybody in Germany learned to fly in a Clem 20. It was the definitive trainer. It's low wing, a lot bigger than any of those other airplanes. It was like a 43-foot wingspan, and a Cub is like 36, and Tiger Moths are, I think, 28 or 30 foot or something. And it had 20 horsepower.
Wow.
And
20 horsepower.
20 horsepower. And originally I was going to build it as a Clem 25, which was a lot more common. The 20 was obviously the predecessor. And I ran across a story of a young, very bright young fellow who learned to soloed like in 8 or 9 hours or something. This was in Germany.
Oh, quick.
And his parents were sort of so impressed. He wasn't from an incredibly wealthy family, but a reasonably well-to-do family. They offered that he could either have a motorcycle or an airplane, and they were about the same price, because the Clems were very inexpensive airplanes. They were the sort of everyman flyer. Yeah, that is a very early Clem 20. That's with the smaller wing. It had a much, much longer wing, but it's the right tail and it's the square top fuselage. And
this is their pylon racer. Their clipped
right,
wing pylon.
No,
Clem 20.
It was a one-off wing that they tried and they didn't like it, so they went back to the bigger wing. But anyhow, he opted for the Clem 20. I would have done the same thing. Flew it, loved it, flew it all over. He was in the Berlin area. But yeah, that's a Clem 20. That's basically a Clem 20.
Like the wing protectors.
Yep. And that's even got the 20 horsepower engine, which, by the way, was designed by Fritz Porsche.
Okay.
Oh, wow.
Porsche engine. He was the guy that designed the engine. Anyhow, at that time, Hindenburg was trying to convince people to get back into airplanes and sport aviation and stuff. And so they offered a 10,000 Reichsmark prize for best sport accomplishment. Go out and do something wonderful. Tell us about it. And we think yours is the best. You get the 10,000 Reichsmark prize. And this young fellow, he was, I think, 22 at the time, thought about it and thought, well, I think the Clem had a 10-gallon gas tank in it. He built 2 5-gallon gas tanks and put them down the wing, so he had like 20 gallons total, and figured that he could fly nonstop from Berlin to Moscow. And this was, no instrumentation to speak of, minimal maps, a handheld compass. The compass was built into the airplane. And he packed himself a lunch and took off and did it. And flew to Moscow and had so much fun. He thought, well, this is sort of fun. And so he continued on, and he ended up going all the way down through the Urals, all the way into India. He had dinner with Gandhi. He knew like 4 or 5 languages. He was an incredibly personable kid. Everybody seemed to love it, love everybody he met. He had dinner with Gandhi. He went down, spent like a month with the royal family in Siam, Thailand
Oh
at
yeah,
the time.
Thailand.
And
Yeah.
in fact, the youngest daughter, he became like the beloved uncle. And when he was finally getting ready to leave, she gave him her Persian cat, the Siamese cat.
Oh yeah, kitty, kitty.
Yeah,
Oh, they got a mascot,
every photo after this point, every photo of him, he's holding the cat, including
huh?
he's in the cockpit one time. He's got the cat in his hand. Now, I don't know whether the cat flew with him or had a cage or what, but the cat was like, he was inseparable from the cat after that. But then he went up. He went up the Chinese coast, hopped across to Japan, spent time with the royal family in Japan.
Not the emperor.
They took the wings off the airplane. The airplane wings would come off and fold. Bought a ticket on a steamer, went over to San Francisco, spent like a month in Hollywood, the toast of Hollywood. There's pictures of him with all of the famous movie stars of the era. This is like 1925. 1925 or 1920.
There's no movie about this guy?
Yeah, sounds awesome.
Or did I miss that? Because that seems like the perfect aviation movie.
It would be. And he flew up across the country. He stopped in Detroit, and he stayed with Henry Ford for a while and got the tour of all of Detroit. He went up and he made
it over the Rockies.
He took his camera along with the airplane only had an 8,000 foot altitude limit. It couldn't go above that because of the small engine. So he had to almost go down into Mexico.
Okay. Just went around the Rockies.
Do some scud running, yeah.
If you look at the path he took, it was like way down into Texas and back up. And he went all the way to. He had taken his camera with him, so he had taken pictures of like the Taj Mahal from the air. He had taken pictures of the Great Wall of China. He had taken pictures of the Forbidden City. There's some airborne shots of the Forbidden City that he had taken from the airplane with his camera. And he ended up going over up through Detroit and over the Niagara Falls, and he's got a bunch of pictures from there. And he ended up in New York, put it on a steamer, went over to England, flew it across England, hopped across France, and made his way back to Berlin. I think it took him 13 months, 25,000 mile, or I think it was like 24,000, because he did all sorts of side trips.
Mm-hmm.
It was 13 months, 25,000 miles. If I remember right, his average speed was 64 miles an hour, and his gas economy was like 46 miles to a gallon or something like that. I mean, and yes, it would make a great movie. And it was just this kid. And he had the adventures he had. Now, this is without any maps. He would literally land in fields and with hand signals or weather, talk to the farmer and find out like where the next town was. And he'd fly there and find somebody that spoke one of the 6 languages he had and learn like where to go next. And, just amazing.
That's amazing. I don't think anybody would believe it if it was a TV show or a movie.
Right. And the thing was, the airplane, the original engine made the entire trip 470 hours of running or something like that.
Wow.
With one, he had to rebuild the engine once. So they had to do a valve job or something. And there's a picture of him working on the engine with it sitting on the arms of a wicker chair in India. And he's working on fixing the engine while it's sitting on this arms of a wicker chair. Yes.
So I guess when you're flying that plane, you kind of relive that life. Like, what was it like to fly?
It's a great airplane to fly. It's a lot of fun. It's ridiculously light. It's a 73-inch span, and it weighs under 3 pounds.
What?
Wow.
Yes. And I build it.
Your own design? Is it your own design?
Yeah. Well, I started out a little bit with the old Crick drawings, but I built my own version of it. Crick was a German scale company, and they offered a 73-inch, pretty accurate, but I had to modify it to make it the 20. And I actually found a picture of it, and I tried to make a pilot that looked a lot like the young fellow who's in the cockpit, front cockpit. And I found a little Siamese cat, and it's sitting with him in the cockpit. For fun. It's not for scale. I made it into his markings, and I have a lot of fun flying that. But it's not a good airplane in crosswinds. It's not a good airplane. It's got the landing gear is really close together, so it's not a good crosswind airplane. But if it's just a nice, gentle day or the evenings, it's a lot of fun to fly. And it will fly about. It's got 3 of the A123, the big, the 2 amp hour A123 cells in it. And I would estimate it could easily fly 20 minutes without even trying.
Wow. Does it have the Astroflight brushed, or you got something
No,
more
it's
modern?
got a, I think it's got a Scorpion outrunner in it, if I remember right. It's either a Scorpion or a Cobra. But it's a small one. I mean, it's like one of the 2200 class kind of.
Oh, tiny, yeah.
So now I have to ask this question. This is kind of this is the trivia we do here in the roundtable. What battery connector do you use on your batteries?
Mostly Anderson power poles.
Oh my gosh!
You must have a stash of them.
Yes.
They're still available. We can buy them from any electronic.
Yes. Yeah, I like the shape of your jib, Mr. Shaw.
We have a winner.
Yes, I'm a big fan of the power poles. They make fun of me for using them, but I told them they're
on the
really,
really high powered stuff. I use the bullet connectors, but not in the housings. I use the one at a time. You don't want to side load those bullet connectors. They can do strange things. So like on my Checkmate and things like that, those have the bullet connectors. So. And all the my couple high-speed flying wings and that. So,
fantastic.
If you're not familiar, the Checkmate sadly it was lost a couple of years ago. Was one of the Reno Unlimited racers, highly modified Yak 11.
Remember that one.
Tiny compared to it was the David and Goliath of the Reno racing set. If you walk up to a Sea Fury. Even standing on your tiptoes, you can't touch the bottom of the spinner. There's just no way.
It's big. Huh?
If you walk up to a Mustang, you can maybe touch the bottom of the spinner flat-footed. You're really stretched, but you can do it. The Bearcat, same thing. You can't touch the bottom of the spinner. Walk up to the Checkmate and you put your hand on top of the spinner. It's that much smaller.
Little snub fighter.
Yeah. Well, it was a 30-foot wingspan. They had an R2800 in it with a supercharger and a cut-down prop off of a Sky Raider. They had almost 3,000 horsepower in this little thing. And it always came in like second or third. It was like just waiting for I had talked, the fellow who flew it was Sherman Smoot. And I had actually talked to him at Reno one time, and he said he never had it at full power. It just started getting to be way too squirrely. He flew with enough power to keep it under control and waiting for people to make mistakes because he never really could open it up all the way. It was just crazy.
Way too much power.
Right. Oh yeah.
Wow.
When somebody who flies an unlimited racer tells you it's too squirrely, it's probably too squirrely.
Yeah.
So I've got weird esoteric knowledge of stuff, and so weird things that I remember. And I remember somebody writing, I don't know if it was a column or a post about you. So the power flying reminded me of this, that you were at some sort of fly-in and I think you were flying somebody else's plane and you were trying to fly it at the least amount of power possible to keep it in the air. Is that something that sound familiar to you?
I've done that to demonstrate what can be done.
Okay. So I'm going
people who can, would claim that, they couldn't even get it to fly. And I, do best energy management. I get like 5 or 6 minutes of aerobatics out of an airplane that somebody else couldn't even get to fly. So it's a matter of, watch Bob Hoover videos.
Yeah.
Everything he says to heart. I wrote an article about low speed aerobatics years ago about how you use what you've got. And the skill of aerobatics comes from what you do on the stick and rudder, not how much horsepower is under the hood. And if you're relying on horsepower, you're a bad pilot. You're incompetent. And so the real way of learning aerobatics is keep backing the power down and still get the corrections in to do what you got to do.
Really fly it on the wing.
that's when you have to learn how to do aerobatics.
Interesting.
And then if you've got the horsepower, it just makes it trivial because now you know all of the, error corrections you've got to do. But yeah, you can fly airplanes on a lot less power than most people would ever believe. I act as a pilot and also sort of an advisor for all of the University of Michigan aeronautical engineering projects the students build and that.
Ah.
And trust me, I have now flown a very large number of airplanes. These things are huge because sometimes the missions or the payloads they've got to carry or whatever requires big airplanes, heavy, but then they have power limits.
Oh, yeah.
And like the one airplane was an 18-foot span, and I think it was almost 50 pounds with all of the stuff it had to carry. And the maximum power, they actually have a little thing that limits you to 750 watts.
Yeah, we're familiar with those.
You're talking about flying on like 12 watts a pound.
Yeah.
Trust me, every takeoff looked like the Spirit of St. Louis. It's like you can see the wheels bounce a little, and then the bounces got a little farther apart, and finally, like a 1 degree climb angle, And so you'd be surprised what you can fly with. I'm not going to say it's easy, and there's some pucker factors if there's any kind of turbulence, but you can do it.
Right. That's a good segue. You mentioned the article you wrote about low power aerobatics. And then we talked earlier about how your de Havilland Comet was a good ambassador to show people the viability of electric power. So from my perspective, I think your biggest contribution to, I guess, promoting electric power is a series of articles that you did that in layman's terms and with some formulas explain the science behind electric power systems. Kind of demystified all those things.
Yeah, I think the first one I wrote was in Model Builder in like 1987 or something. And it outlined basically this method of design that I had, developed. I just did an awful lot of experiments and work to try to figure out how to take, okay, this is the airplane. This is what I got to do. This is what what weight profile I got to shoot for. This is what power I need, what kind of speeds I'm expecting, how to match the prop, and yeah, I had come up with this, and somebody said, why don't you write that down? And so I did, and I sent it off to Bill Northrup, and they published it, so, and then I started writing. I knew Larry Marshall, who was editor for Model Airplane News for a while, and I wrote a bunch of articles for them on twins and on all sorts of stuff. And I hate, no, keep in mind, I hate writing. I mean, it drives me crazy to have to sit down and, grind through and write it and optimize it and make it right and pick the right words. Partly because when you're a scientist, you've got like 5 years of research and you've got to report it into a journal, and you're given 2 pages. And in 2 pages, and you can't fudge like going to a smaller print size or something. You've got to present 5 years worth of your research in 2 pages. You have to make every word count 5 ways. And if you're going to put a graph in there, that graph better equally say whatever the text column you're supplying.
Space it takes up. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that writing style carried over, that, trying to make sure that what was in my mind ended up in the people who were reading it as best as I could. And so I never really cared, but I would do it because I could see that it was required. And somebody told me that it's okay to do the research, but if you don't go out and tell people about it, nobody knows about it.
Right.
And so you really do have to go out and sort of be a showman for a while. You got to go to conferences, you got to give the talks, you have to do it. You means you can't be back doing your own, continuing the research, but you have to bring the rest of the world up to speed. I finally got that. Okay, that's the reason to write articles. Certainly not for fame and glory, or pay. I mean, it's like, I mean, it's just, if you think that somebody could benefit or not make, or minimize the number of mistakes they're going to have to go through and get some success, it's worth doing it. So.
Well, if it makes you feel better about this, I think here 30, 40 years later after writing those articles, the premises that you put forth are still being used today, especially the watts per pound rules. That's
Right.
still the primary principle that I use, and I think most electric flyers use to build.
You know, when they don't just write out the check and buy the next ARF. You know?
Or that. So again, I started getting into this in the late 90s. And at that time, I was a card-carrying engineer, aerospace engineer, practicing, working at NASA. And I did some incredibly stupid things with electric airplanes just because I didn't know any better. And in my degree, there wasn't a class on electric motor philosophy and things like that. You just kind of had to figure it out. So I found RC groups. I found what was Electric Flight Only, and that was, they provided a link to your articles there. And that was the thing that kind of, it's flipped the switch from them. Like, oh, there's ways to actually figure out how to make all this work. Yeah.
It isn't just magic.
There's a method to the madness. And then once I had that basic knowledge down, it was really off to the races. And
Just out of curiosity, what branch of NASA did you work at?
I was at the Johnson Space Center working in the shuttle / space station programs.
Yeah.
So I was there for 16 years. Fitz is still there.
Oh, okay. I was at the time it was called Lewis Research. It's now Glenn Research in Cleveland. That's where I worked. I was there for pretty much throughout the moon landings.
Oh, nice.
It was a cool area to be there. So
Yeah.
and in a little way, I was involved with Apollo 13. I was, they made it sound like everything happened at Houston, but every branch of NASA was frantically working on trying to solve the problems. And Cleveland is where all the really exotic electronics was done. That was the specific thing that Cleveland was really good at. And I was on that team to try to solve how do you bring the spacecraft up and without blowing everything out or wasting the energy and stuff like that. And so there was a couple of sleepless nights while we were hammering away on all of those problems. So I mean, a lot happened and no one group can claim it. It literally was a nationwide effort.
Oh yeah,
everybody just did not sleep. They stayed and they did everything they could to make sure that it happened. It was pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's I feel that because I work on basically the next generation moon program on that. So I can totally understand how you feel about that and how much of a team effort it is. And now ours is more international now. And so we've got a lot of kittens to herd on this, and it's just been fascinating.
That's a very good way of putting it.
Well, getting back to the original point of this section.
You got a point there, Terry?
Wandering.
Really, thank you for suffering through writing those articles and bringing that knowledge together into one spot to digest for people like me who kind of didn't know where to start and didn't know which direction to go. Those articles were, I guess, the starting point for me and crucial to my learning the science of electric motor systems. And I don't think you can discount the effect they had on shaping the industry as well.
Yeah, no, I could very easily see that because with the exception of Astroflight, everybody in the electronics industry had this idea that all electrics were ever going to be was a fringe, to fly a glider or a trainer in a place where maybe you couldn't deal with the noise, and there was no future. So that's all that anybody was kidding or thinking about. I remember Frank Garsher at Midwest proudly wanted to show me his electric kit that they were going to offer. I don't remember what the name of it was off the top of my head. And I remember opening the box and I looked at him and I said, how many airplanes is this supposed to build? There was like 3 or 4 times the amount of wood you would have needed to make an airplane. This thing was built like the proverbial brick outhouse. And it was like, well, it's got a heavy motor and a heavy battery. Yeah. It doesn't mean you have to make a heavy airplane.
Right.
But yeah, it's like no concept of, but eventually, people started, listening and, Of course, all in the electric community was a very unique community because a lot of people in it were people that designed their own airplanes or wanted to do things themselves. And so you just had this universal. In fact, I remember going to the first KRC, and it was amazing to go down the flight line and look at everybody's airplane. Everybody had solved the problems in different ways. Like how you held the battery, how you did this, how you mounted the motor, how you attached the prop, what motor you used, what batteries you used. Everything was different because everybody was engineering on their own. And there was some early newsletters that the Ampere is the oldest one still standing.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
Yeah, there was one out of the Seattle, Washington area that was the first one, I think. And there was one out of the Southern California area later. I think I'm trying what it was called. It's drawing a blank. I want to say I think it might actually have been something like Seth, but it wasn't like the group down in Atlanta, Georgia.
So the Sign Electric Flyers of San Diego.
Yeah, something like that. I don't remember what the nickname was, but yeah, they had a newsletter. There was like 4 or 5 newsletters. And, we all got each other's newsletters, and I wrote a bunch of articles for the newsletters, some of which got then fleshed out and ended up in magazines. But it was a long time before the rest of the rest of the commercial world finally woke up and realized there's a market here. Bob Boucher and Astroflight were really about the only ones that saw the market for any kind of performance airplanes. Now, they were really big, out in Southern California, everything were the rocket gliders, the 27 Nightcad, gliders with, 5,000 5,000 foot a minute climb rates. I mean, they were
flying welders.
Oh, yeah, they called them welders, yeah. Just outrageous performance out of these things. But there wasn't much outside of that. There were a few people on the West Coast tinkering with scale, but, I was more serious about scale because you can fly a sport airplane and impress people, but if you fly that same set of maneuvers with a scale airplane, somehow that makes a much bigger statement. It's one thing to see some sport airplane doing a roll or a loop, watching a, scale airplane do it. It seems to lend more credibility, I guess, or more, wow.
Interesting.
Even though there's no difference aerodynamically, it's just a little bit more time to make the shapes right and maybe a bigger, bulkier fuselage than you would have done if you were building a sport plane or, something like that. But I think the mental concept is that the scale airplane is a bigger vote that this is viable and possible.
Right. Well, I gather that for you back in the early days, a lot of the enjoyment you got out of the hobby was solving those power system problems. And
just solving aerodynamics and structures, how you make a structure that can withstand the power without being too heavy. And, there was just a lot of wonderful engineering, fiddles. And, I really enjoyed that. That did the right things for my physicist mind.
Right. Well, now that the power system portion of that is pretty much a turnkey off-the-shelf affair, how do you challenge yourself to maintain that enjoyment?
I have a love for incredibly rare aircraft, many of which have outrageous engineering challenges in their own right. I do not see any reason to build another Cub, or that any modeler needs to ever build another Cub or another Mustang. They've been done to death. And I've sort of taken it on as a mission to find all these unbelievably obscure airplanes and build them. And I take them to air shows and compete. I'm hurt if people can recognize it. Because I'm sort of a historian, and I love to find these airplanes that nobody knows about. The one I'm working on, it's partly built right now, but it's on hiatus at the moment for another project. But there was a 1928, 1929 German airplane called the Darmstadt D-22. You want to type that into your search engine. It was a it was a biplane with very high aspect ratio, tapered wings, cantilever, no interplane struts, and it had 100% stagger. Monocoque fuselage, inverted four-cylinder engine. Amazing airplane. And it's never been modeled. I think I found a photo of one done as a free flight in like the late 30s. That's it. I don't think anybody's ever modeled it. But I've also done the Moeller Stomo, which was a early 30s German airplane with a gull wing, ultra high performance, but ridiculously small. It originally it won aerobatic championship trophies, and actually placed, I think, second in a racing event for things on 18 horsepower. With a two-cylinder boxer engine, two-cylinder, two-cycle boxer engine.
Wow.
Wow. Tiny little thing.
Amazing. But it's probably the most graceful aircraft I think I've ever seen. And I love to fly it because I took it to heart. The real one got its performance by being ridiculously light. The fellow who designed it was a modeler. It was his first design. And it's this, graceful low wing airplane with a gull lowered wing and everything. But I think the airplane with pilot and 5 gallons of gas weighed like 350 pounds or something, and it was a 29-foot wingspan.
Wow. Did you find it, Lee?
That's the Darmstadt.
Wow.
That's the D-22.
Yeah, that's very distinctive.
Yeah.
You seem to have an affinity for German airplanes. Is that because of your German heritage?
Yeah, it could be, but I just find it really. I like some of the airplane designs that I see. I've built airplanes of all nationalities, but I have to admit, a lot of the 1920s and 30s German airplanes are really neat.
Yeah,
and I love the 1930s American racers. If I had to pick one era that I have built more of and more enjoyment is the 1930s racers. I have a GBR-1. I have a de Havilland Comet. I've got a Ryder 8-ball. I've got the Southwind. I've got I'm just trying to go down the line. The Crosby CR4. I've had a Laird Turner Special. Like I said, that's if there was one area of aviation, that's probably been my favorite era.
Cool.
And it was an amazing era because these home-built aircraft were the fastest aircraft in the world. They were 100-mile-an-hour faster than the fastest military airplanes.
Wow.
And so it'd be like today, hey, let's go down and Fred's going to fly his newest airplane. It's supposed to do Mach 4. He's building it in his garage. It would be the same kind of. It was unbelievable that these guys were building these things in their garages, and they were doing 300 mile an hour, 250, 300 mile an hour with these things, and the military airplanes were still stuttering along at like 150 or 160.
And he mixed the fuel in his bathtub.
And a lot of them died while trying to fly these creations.
That's true, yeah.
And of course, I've got the third scale Goon that I fly. That was another electric. I've had a Jeep. I've had a Mercury, a Short Crusader. It's just like I said, it's an era of aviation that I just dearly love. So the 20s and 30s, and the aerobatic airplanes from that era too. I had a Great Lakes. I've had a 450 Sturman. I've been thinking about building a Waco taper wing because I was friends with Bob Lyjack, who was the legendary type taper wing pilot. He used to live in Ann Arbor. He was a professor. He was a professor at U of M.
Okay.
So we would have lunch together occasionally, and really good guy. So.
We need to get a lot of pictures from you, Keith, to add to this podcast. So you need to send us some photos of your unique aircraft.
Okay, I can do that. I'll try to filter through tonight and send them to Terry. So.
All right, cool. Thank you.
Oh, fantastic.
Now, some of these older designs that you have, I assume, were originally flown on NICADs. Have you ever gone through and retrofitted them to the A123s?
Oh yeah, a large number of them are now. A lot of them are still flying with the original, Astro geared motors. But I just replaced the NICAD pack with the A123 cells. To say A123, okay, lithium iron phosphate. There are a lot of companies that made lithium iron phosphate batteries, but they were like low power things. A123 was a research organization that they hold patents on how to make a lithium iron phosphate be able to put out current.
Lots of it.
They solved how to get the impedance low so that you could suck 50 or 60 amps out of these cells without hurting them.
Power density. Yeah.
And repeat and get the power density, stuff like that. It's now, they were the research branch. The production branch of the same company is called Lithium Works. And so they now are available under Lithium Works banner, but I still call them A123s.
So why do you prefer them over the lithium polymer?
They don't catch fire. They live.
That's what I thought.
They live forever. I have packs in some of my airplanes, and these aren't being baby. These fly hardcore air shows. I have some packs that are over 800 flights.
Wow.
And they're still I still do the same routine I did at the start. I maybe get like 5 seconds less flight time. Just no change. Day after day, they are identical. The other nice thing is you don't have to baby them. I charge them at the end of the day and just leave them that way because they have no memory. You don't have to put them in storage. Like I said, they can't catch fire. They're stable. They're reproducible. And the thing is, you can use all of them. You can literally use the pack down to the point that the prop stops. Doesn't hurt the batteries.
Oh,
so
okay.
You have to, if you want to do a side-by-side comparison, you have to say, okay, the nominal 2 amp hour A123 cell has to be compared with like a 3000 or 3300 milliamp hour LiPo pack because you can use all of it. So instead of thirds of it. So that's the one thing people miss. But they work better in colder weather. LiPos take a nosedive at about 40 degrees, and I've flown A123s down to 10 degrees, and they're still okay.
Wow.
So the capacity is still around that 2,000 milliamp hour mark?
Yeah, they're technically like a 2,500, but in reality, you get about maybe, if you really ran them completely dead, you probably get about 2,200. But I rarely ever get down with when I recharge them at the end of the flight, I always seems like the way I set my airplanes up, the routines I fly, the times that I fly, which is usually 6 to 8 minutes for most of my aerobatic routines. I'm usually putting in like 1,800. So I just never seem to run them out. And on the bigger airplanes, of course, you don't rely on a BEC. You run a separate receiver battery. So you could go flat if you wanted to. And the other thing about the lithium polymer cell, or the lithium iron oxide cell, or
phosphate
LiPo, instead of A1, let's just say A123s, is that the power stays consistent right to the end, and then it just drops.
Oh,
then it's a cliff.
Yeah, real flat.
I was flying my Zlin 526 one time, and I had gone through my routine, like a 21 maneuver routine, and there was a couple of maneuvers I wasn't happy with, so I wanted to practice those a few more times. And I had gone and I had done my vertical 4-point roll, and I got it that time. I came out. I was going to go and do a loop, and I came out of the vertical 4-point roll, leveled off, went to do a loop, and I almost see the prop stop. Okay, coasted around, came in and danced. It couldn't even taxi. I advanced the motor and it didn't even move. So the last maneuver right before it, I'd done the vertical 4-point roll. And that's so that you can, there's like no power drop.
Wow,
right?
Interesting.
You don't know the edge is coming until it's there.
You already passed it.
Bigger airplanes, you don't want to rely on a BEC.
Yeah.
So when the A123s were fairly new, which is 10 or 15 years ago?
I've been around for 20 years.
Is it that? Okay. Well, they were used a little bit in power tools. And
right.
so the ones that I have now were harvested from power tool packs. So what's the best option for, I'm sorry?
You can buy them outright.
Okay, well, yeah, I was going to ask the best source for them currently.
Storetronics. There's actually a store in Detroit. Storetronics. STORTRONICS.com. Storetronics.com. You put an order in, and I get them within a day. And if I put an order in, literally the next day, there's a box on my doorstep.
All right.
And they're like $5 a cell now. They huge reduction in price a few years ago.
Really? So you have to buy them individual cells, or do they have packs that you can?
No, you buy them
pre-made.
individual, make your own.
They're easy to solder because there's no aluminum tabs. You just solder like you would a NiCad pack.
Right. Yeah. You solder if you know how to assemble a NiCad pack. It's exactly the same concept. So.
I got to whip out my old hammerhead solder tip.
No, I use braid. If I want to do an end on end, I put them side by side, put the braid across, and then fold the cell.
Oh, right, yeah.
And number one, that gives you an almost right flush to the surface. Now you have a place to solder your cell tap. And then once the pack is assembled, you put it in the heat shrink. And that's the place to. Like I said, they sell all sorts of packs, all sorts of cells, but they have the lithium work cells for a very reasonable price.
All right.
Oh, okay.
Good to know.
What do you use? Do you use the 18650s or a different size, or you just?
I use most of my big airplanes. I use the 23460 or something. It's
a little bigger.
2.5 amp hour. The 18360 is like a 1100 mil cell, but you get about 100 million. You get about a 1 amp hour out of it. Yeah, that's really? the bigger cell that.
Gotcha.
Yeah, the 22650.
Yeah, I don't know if you can see it, Fitz, but this is a 2-cell pack of the larger one, and it's probably the diameter of a subsea NiCad, but I don't know, half again as long.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like an inch in diameter and 2.5 or 2 3/4 inches long or something. And then the nice thing is, most scale airplanes have got huge fuselages, so the battery pack rattles around in there.
Yeah.
And I never use Velcro. All my packs are bolted in place. I don't want to take a chance on things moving. On little tiny airplanes, Velcro is great, but if the battery pack is anything more than a few ounces, I want it bolted down.
Good thinking.
Yeah, I know all about battery packs leaving the airplane.
Yeah. Well, number one, you don't want to. Every time you put it in, it could be a different CG unless you were really careful about putting like a backstop to make sure that the pack is in exactly the same spot each time. So you don't want any. If you're doing low altitude aerobatics, you don't want any surprises.
Sure.
Yeah, it's interesting because I do use the LiFePO iron phosphate batteries in my gas planes for receiver packs.
Right.
Usually because they're 6.6 volts. I can run regular servos without a regulator, and like I said, they have really good qualities. But I never really thought about going back and using it in my electric planes.
You can. I mean, like I said, I do use some LiPos, like on my ducted fans, where usually you've got relatively small fuselages or ridiculous high currents. Ducted fans are incredibly inefficient.
Oh, yeah.
If you even get close to 30%, you're doing good. A prop will run circles around a ducted fan until you get to outrageous power levels.
Yeah.
And so some of my ducted fans I use LiPo packs on, and some of my little tiny airplanes, like the few ounce kind of airplanes, they have the little like 180s or 250 kind of battery packs. Those are fine. But anything from the sort of the 4-foot wings, the 3 or 4 cells, small cells and up, it used to be so frustrating to buy a LiPo pack, and I could tell within, even babying it and taking care of it, within 10 cells, I could tell that the performance in the airplane was different.
Huh.
And if you're flying air shows and you're flying low altitude, you've got to rely on your system, and you can't be thinking, well, I had it last week, but maybe this week I'm not going to have that power level. And I just the main reason I went away from them was they just weren't reliable enough. They just would not reproduce the power that I was used to day in and day out. Because I'm not doing it as much now, but I used to fly like air shows every single weekend from middle of May till the middle of October. I'd be on the road flying air shows, and you've got to trust your airplane if you're going to do things at 0 altitude. You know? So
I would say my experience would be the same as yours in the early days of lipos. I remember buying my first Thunder Power 8C lipo battery,
they
and
started
felt
out
like
at they started out at 3C.
right. Yeah, I skipped that version, and
I started out with the Kokum batteries that were started out.
Yeah, the Kokams.
They were
Yes.
they were the first batteries and the first lipo. They were actually a company that were researching they were a research division of a company that was specifically designed to try to come up with a high current version of a lipo.
okay,
That was what their thing was, and they somehow heard about model airplane people. And so RC pilots were like literally the first people in the world playing with high current lipos. I don't know if you know that or not. Like
I didn't know
we
that.
were
Interesting.
we were the ground floor of of helping them because they wanted feedback. You wrote them letters on like and to tell the truth, I mean I had a few cells fail, but I still have some Kokum packs that are still viable and flying, and they're going to be 30 years old now.
Dang.
And they're still working. They're still rock hard.
I think I got a pack
so-
somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah. They were like maybe a 6 or a 10C, kind of rating, but they were a real 10C rating. They weren't
yeah,
75C. Right? Yeah, sure. And if you go through that calculation, you can, the wiring would explode.
right. Well, I'm one of those people who almost always charges at a 1C rate, and usually the application I use is not near what their maximum rating is for. So my more recent experience, and I would say the past 10 years or so, has been very consistent performance with lipos. So I don't know if you've experimented anytime recently, but you may get a different result than you have in the past.
Well, like I said, I use them on some of my the couple of jets that I fly. I use the lipo packs.
Yeah.
And yeah, maybe at the way that I use them, they live, but I maybe see it about every. It's not quite to the point where after 10 flights I notice a drop, but after a year I definitely notice a drop.
Yeah, for sure.
And so it's like every year I got to replace the packs in those airplanes because yes, it will still fly the airplane. Yeah, but not with the routine that I'm doing, not what I want to show with the airplane. So. My Checkmate had some of the early high capacity, high output, current 5 amp hour cells, and the first pack didn't even make it 10 flights, and it was remember right that 10 cell pack was $500,
Yeah,
and I didn't even get 10 flights out of it. So
that
was very disappointing.
Yeah, I'll bet.
And the company says, well. And if you look at I was charging at 1C. I was nowhere near their current limit, but still.
Yeah.
Later it got better, but yeah, that first pack was pretty disappointing.
Yeah.
So.
Right. Well, I think we probably need to start finding a path out. So,
do we have any other questions? Quick, that if you need any other information. I mean, we've been just wandering aimlessly around here, so
that's what we do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have a list of events that you'll be attending in the coming months?
Let's see. Dave Greif always runs a 1-day meet over near Quincy, Michigan. I go to that one. Obviously, the 2-day meet, it's one official day, one unofficial day that Ken Myers and I run. That's always the first full weekend after 4th of July, so it would be the 12th and 13th this year. I'm not. I used to literally rack up like 500 miles a weekend. I mean, I would fly air shows all over the place. I flew several air shows like down in Texas and Tennessee and down in Louisiana, and I went down to Florida a couple of times, and those were monumental drives. And to try to do that on sort of like a long weekend with only me driving, I mean, no backup driver or anything. It was a grueling experience, but that's the other thing is I racked up an awful lot of miles to demonstrate airplanes and convince people that, I remember going after to us, electrics would be normal and well matured and everything, I would go to air shows occasionally and I'd pull out my like giant scale Bearcat, with the full retracts and the 24, the 2216 prop and everything. And people would come over and like, well, how do you launch it? I said, it's off the ground. It's got retracts. And they were just like, huh? Because electrics meant you had to hand launch it. And they would walk up and, and if I got one of those questions, no, I'd take off and pull up and go right into a vertical forward point roll after takeoff. The gas engine equivalents of that airplane couldn't hope to do that. So yeah, it's amazing. I would occasionally go to places that were like that they had never seen an electric, or their idea of an electric was some little fluffy glider, and they had never experienced what an electric could do, and they were like just literally stunned. And well, it's got to be special equipment. No, you can buy all of this. Here's the part numbers,
Yeah.
And so you just can't build with concrete,
Right. We've come a long way, baby.
Or can you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just like I said, I'm not on the road as much as I used to be. I may be flying like 6 or 7 air shows, in the year, or maybe more. It depends on how I'm doing and how, people ask me to come to a meet. Sure, I'll go and, participate, but I'm not actively just going out pounding the pavement like I used to. We've won. We don't have to show anybody. Electric airplanes are now the dominant form of flying in the United States and in the world, for that matter.
Right.
I mean, it's electrics and it's gas and gasoline engines for the really big airplanes, and glow engines are gone. I mean, you go into a hobby shop, and if there's maybe one glow engine there, it's amazing, and it's usually a four-cycle. So yeah, we've won. There's no reason to have to, torture yourself and be on the road all the time. So,
Well, I think you can take a lot of credit for that transition.
well, yeah, that is one thing. Like I said, yeah, the fact that I was designing airplanes that maybe were a little harder than most people would have been able to do. And yes, I understood the physics and the electronics to pull everything I could pull out of the systems. And I'm a pretty good pilot, so I could make the airplanes look better than they probably really were. And all of those things did help convince people to at least give it a try. So yeah, and enough people saw me in different places all over the country that, so I guess if I do have a niche, that was the part that I added, is to try to take scale airplanes, and show that they can do everything that a sport plane that can do and more, and it's all completely doable by anybody who just wants to, give it a try. You convince people, okay, you're not going to have a bad needle valve setting. You're not going to have an engine fail. You're not going to have a clunk in your tank get tangled up and, have the engine cut out in the middle of an outside loop. The airplane's not going to get fuel soaked. It's not going to, not the vibration aren't going to hack the servos to death. The reliability and reproducibility, I thought, was always the most important things about electrics. Not so much the clean and quiet, but the reliability and reproducibility. If you know that you can do that 21 maneuver sequence in front of a crowd with an outside maneuver at 2 feet off the ground, if you did it last week, you can do it this week.
Yeah.
There's just no question. I mean, it's just going to be there for you. And with a glow engine, it was always you didn't get the right needle, or it was a high humidity day, or something was different. The airplane is going to behave different. You're going to fly it into the ground if you try to fly it exactly the same way. So,
what I used to tell people is electric wasn't trouble-free. They had their own specific kinds of troubles, but they tended to be the kinds of things that you would address in your workshop rather than fiddling with at the field.
right.
So,
Yeah, well, I remember people saying that, like, the electrics are too fiddly. I mean, you got to solder, you got to do this, and this. And I said, so setting up the fuel tank at exactly the right level compared to the carburetor, and getting the linkage in so you don't get bubbles, and make sure that the clunk is in the right spot, and fiddling with the low speed idle and the mid-range idle, the mid-range adjustment and the needle valve, and getting the muffler pressure all dialed in, and the right nitro content and the right glow plug isn't hard, is easy to do, and they all were looking like, oh, once you go through it, and if that's all you've known, you just deal with that and you live with it.
Yep.
But as soon as you get away from it and you start realizing that you don't have to do all that stuff, it makes you realize how incredibly hard trying to fly glow engines, particularly in the earlier days of of carburetors, when they were not the greatest carburetors in the world. It was a monumental effort trying to get something to idle, without it loading up or going lean or something. It's not easy. So
Yeah. But all our glow fans right now are going, yeah, but I can't hear it.
yeah. Well,
You can tell me all you want, but you can't hear the sound or the roar of the engine.
play the video for the Bugatti.
There you go.
Eyes open up.
All right, well, Keith, I think we better wrap things up. It's been great having you on. The data dump is going to be one for the ages. Thank you so much for joining us. An absolute pleasure. Hopefully we will cross paths maybe in person at some point in the future. That'd be wonderful.
Okay.
Although we're opposite ends of the country, but you never know.
So it goes.
So there you have your own little bio sheet from.
Yeah, I was elected to the AMA Hall of Fame back in 2000 something.
2002.
Very nice.
Yeah, so we have a link on our screen right now that you can read more about Dr. Keith Shaw. I'm just going to go ahead and say that now.
Yeah.
And because you are
not medical doctor, physicist.
I don't care. I still like it. That was good.
Dr. Shaw.
Dr. Shaw.
There's an old joke, we're the real doctors. You guys are merely physicians.
Oh, ouch.
So there's a link on our screen, but if you want, you can go to modelaircraft.org and just type in the search bar Keith Shaw, and it'll pull up his Hall of Fame AMA history.
Yeah, so good stuff in there. You've done some things and seen some stuff, so we really appreciate you.
When you start out with vacuum tubes and you end up with modern electronics with fly-by-wire with fail safes and safe flying and autonomous flight and all this stuff, it's hard to believe that it's sort of like the people like my father was born before the airplane flew. He was born in 1900, and so to see in his lifespan what came around, and he lived long enough to see computers and stuff like that, and it's hard to imagine that all had happened in his lifespan. And now in my lifespan, I've seen a lot happen too. So
it all happened pretty much in the 20th century. So it's amazing how much the hobby has grown, and I can't understate how much. Well, we owe a lot of it to you. We really appreciate all your efforts.
It was the work of a lot of people, which unfortunately a lot of them either aren't around anymore or are really unsung heroes. There was a lot of people that I knew that did amazing things. I remember them, but I don't know how many other people remember.
Well, maybe that's an excuse I know you may not like to write much, but you need to write the great book of model airplanes, your great tome. You've seen it all.
Yeah. In my copious spare time.
Between obscure models,
right?
Which I really hope to see one day. But thank you so much, guys. Got any last words before we head out?
No, I'm just going to give Keith some brief instructions because we didn't talk about this before, but we're going to do a little outro here. Stick around, and we'll say goodbye to you after that.
Okay.
Yeah. Stick around for the after show.
Yeah.
Well, everybody, thanks for joining us on this very special episode of the RC Roundtable. Please like and subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube. If you're listening to us on a podcast,
Sorry,
the heck is that? If you oh, you guys yelling at me now? It's Terry's. If you guys listening on audio podcasts, please give us a like and to help the algorithms. But thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time. Any comments, questions? Please leave us a note at contact@rcroundtable.com. Send us your email. Tell us how you like the show. Maybe even if you got some good juicy stories about Keith Shaw, we'd love to hear about them too. But on that note, thanks for hanging with us, and we will see you next time.
All right. Take care, guys.
Please visit our website at rcroundtable.com. That's where you will find all of our podcast episodes. You can also find a little bit of background information about the show host and leave comments and suggestions about the show. There are links to a few of our favorite vendors and also links to our various social media accounts. Thank you for watching and listening.